Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Mark Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. Please allow me to introduce you to our guest today, Darius Mirshahzadeh, author of The Core Value Equation. Darius, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mark.
I'm excited to have you. I really enjoyed your book. I thought you did a great job with that, and certainly you learned a lot of lessons yourself. So before we start about the book, please tell the audience a little bit about your background and your own entrepreneurial experience.
Yeah, so I'm a serial entrepreneur. My father was an entrepreneur, actually. He moved here right after the Iran hostage crisis in the late 70s. Our family did. And I grew up with a father who was just very entrepreneurial, and I was very entrepreneurial. Same with my brother, and so we got into the mortgage business when we were very young, teenagers actually, and just worked our way through that business. I'm still, relatively young considering having been in the business for 20 years. But we built our first business was called Twin Capital Mortgage. We built that from one person, myself, to about 150 employees in 3 years. It was number 40 in the Inc. 500, just under $10 million of revenue. And we did that in our mid-20s. And so that was a really integral learning experience. From that, I got involved in Entrepreneurs Organization, which is a global community for entrepreneurs. Used to be called YEO. And I got admitted into this program called Birthing a Giants, which is a entrepreneurial executive education program out of MIT. And it's ran by Vern Harnish, who wrote the famous book Scaling Up.
He's also I like his book.
Yeah, Vern's a great author and written a great book. But that was my introduction into what I call entrepreneurial operating systems, mid-market systems specifically, and it was my first introduction to the core values and how do you use core values in a business. And I spent the next decade getting obsessed about it and using it as a tool for scale in my business and to create impact. So much so where I basically learned how to operationalize it to create value in the businesses I built. Now, my business was a subprime mortgage lender, which was not a good place to be in 2007 and 8. And we eventually shut that business down. And in 2013, I ended up doing a deal with a company called The Money Source, which was a very small company at the time. The founder, who ended up being my business partner, was in Long Island, New York. And we built that company from about 30 employees to 1,000 employees in 3 years. It now manages about $75 billion worth of mortgages. It was a really interesting ride. But one of the things I got to learn was how do you apply these things I learned over that decade to create massive scale and to do it in a way where we didn't have the same types of growing pains I'd experienced in my previous businesses. So it was a good ride. And basically my book, The Core Value Equation, was born out of that. And that book was live, was premiered this September worldwide. It's an Amazon bestseller. I actually exited my company. So I'm now, I'm figuring out what's next, but the book is what I've been working on and working with some very interesting CEOs, helping them scale their businesses as well at this time.
Why did you write this book?
It was funny. I've always been a CEO and always been the serial entrepreneur and always been aggressively growing my own businesses. I am not a consultant. I've just now gotten into the world of coaching high growth entrepreneurs, but before that, I was always building my own businesses. And I had mentored a gentleman who out of San Francisco who had a small orthodontics practice through EO. They have a program called Accelerator, and it's where small businesses are being mentored by larger CEOs. And so we became friends. I helped him build his core values for his company. I say I'm a core value evangelist. So I believe core values are the most valuable asset you have in your company to create value and scale. And so he asked me to speak at a conference in Dallas with 1,000 orthodontists, and I had this great talk. And afterwards, there was like 100 people standing in line to talk to me. And the first 6 people asked me, like, is there a book I can read, or is there a class I can take to learn how to do this? And I just kept saying no. I created all this. And by the 7th person, I said, yeah, it's coming out in June.
So that you knew you had a market for it.
Yeah.
I,
So
I want to jump into some of the book, and I noticed that you have a picture of The Godfather, which is my favorite movie of all time. Godfather 1, 2, and I even enjoyed 3. What's your definition of core value driven organization? And just to be fun here, what was The Godfather's core values?
Well, so uh, I believe a core value organization is an organization where the team knows the values. It's the language of the organization. It's the way they talk to each other. It's the way they hold each other accountable. And it basically, it's a centering. It's where people go to understand what is expected of them. And then they make those values come to life in the organization. So if you don't know your core values off the top of your head, if your team doesn't know the core values off the top of their head, and if you're not living it and using it as a decision-making tool organically through the organization, then you likely don't have a core value-driven organization. I think that, honestly, I think that the number one core value for The Godfather was loyalty. It's about putting the family first. Family is probably a big one for them. If I had to guess, I might say excellence. They had to do good work, or else they took them out.
Yeah.
But loyalty above all else. Definitely, that's without question. If I believe that there's a hierarchy of values for both personally and for professional organizations, and their number one without question was loyalty.
You learned a lot about core values watching that movie the 15, 20 times I've watched it. When did you realize developing and stating core values was important?
I had this moment when I was at. I often tell people. Let me back up. I often tell people that I didn't find core values. Core values found me. And I had this moment when I was at MIT where I was asked we did this peer-to-peer workshop the night before we graduated. And if you look at scaling up, and you look at like traction, EOS, or OKRs, these systems around strategy and execution, all of them say you need to have core values. So we all go do it. We all go do that. We all go, figure out what our core values are. We check that box. But what ends up happening is what happened to me at MIT is we had a peer-to-peer workshop, and they asked everyone to stand up if our company had core values. Now, mind you, we're 3 years into the program. We've had time to build this stuff, and everyone stands up. So we all quote unquote had core values. And then they said, well, please stay standing if you can say your core values off the top of your head. And half of the room sat down, and I was in that half, the first half of the room. And then they said, please stay standing if your employees know your core values. Well, the remaining half of the room sat down. And then they said, please stay standing if your customers know your core values. And everyone was sitting down except the two guys at the front who were running the peer-to-peer workshop. And that was a turning point for me, because I realized that for some reason it resonated with me that you needed to have values. And the fact that all these great people who I respected didn't know their own values, or their team didn't know their values, it just seemed like a disconnect. And for some reason, I felt the inclination to start working on it. And the more I worked on it, the more I saw positive results in my business, until it became essentially what I believe to be the most important foundation for growth in the business. It starts with the values. Then you work on strategy. Then you work on execution. And then you optimize to make sure the business gets better on all three of those fronts.
How often do you see core values that are stated and communicated, but not really practiced or even supported? And I think your company, based on your book, went through that in the beginning itself.
Well, there's data around this. 9 out of 10 companies do that. So 90% of companies have values that their team doesn't know. So that's the data. I think it's 9 out of 10, 9.5 out of 10. Most people, I think it is the most valuable asset you have in your business, and it's the most. And I say it's an asset. I say it's the most valuable asset you have in your business, and it's the most underutilized asset you have in your business.
How did you develop your company's core values? And did people just think it was corporate BS that you read in some business book?
The first time around, yes. In fact, one of the girls said it was BS when we rolled them out. So she forgot to mute her phone and said, "Oh, this is such BS," and she didn't use the acronym.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is BS for most. If you don't know your values and your team doesn't know what the values are, then it is corporate BS. So for me, when I sat down that day, the next day I went and I rewrote my values. And I don't even think that's necessarily the best way of doing it, but that's what I chose to do. And what I discovered, and this is just, intuitively, a lot of the stuff that I did was out of frustration. And then I would land on the right result intuitively. And then later I do the research and figure out that there was science and psychology baked around the things that worked. But my book, essentially, I tell people it's a design book because I believe that your values need to be designed for high utility value or else they won't get used. So I'll give you an example, Mark. You have an iPhone or a smartphone, I take
I have
it?
a smartphone, of course, live off of it.
Right. So do you know how many pictures per year people take on their smartphones right now?
Oh, I'm guessing it's got to be like 400 or 500.
Yeah, as a population, 1.1 trillion pictures per year get taken on a smartphone. In 2010, when smartphones first existed, do you know how many people took on their phone then?
100 million?
Yeah, 86 billion.
86.
And if you go back before the smartphone, it's under a billion. The pictures were picked, not even on their phone, pictures taken in the world. So is it that we all suddenly became photographers? No, it's that the utility value of a tool that we happen to carry around with us all the time allowed for us to do that. And I believe that when you design values for high utility value, that's exactly what happens. You go from not using them, which is 9.5 out of 10 companies today, to everyone using them, like my companies, and they become the language of the organization because they're hot, but you got to design for that.
Yeah, you mentioned that in the book that you didn't follow your own core values. What happened?
I just didn't, I didn't know what they were. They were a box that I checked. I always say that, look, we're all taught the first things. If you look at business schools and you look at, best practices in business, you're taught mission, vision, values. So we go and if you don't know why you're supposed to do it, but you just know that, oh, it's important that I have a mission for my business so that we focus on this one thing that's important. And values, we're taught as young children that you have to have good values. So the idea of values is not foreign. But how do you make them come to life in your business is a completely unfixed concept. And so for me, I just did what everybody else did. I checked the box. I went, I built it. I didn't build them for high utility value. They weren't designed for use and they didn't work. And so we ended up breaking them because they weren't alive and well. I mean, it's easy to break something that's not there, and so for us, that's just what happened, just like it happens in any organization. If you say you're something, but you don't actually do the work, then are you really that? And my answer is absolutely not.
Do organizations ever find that they need to evolve and change their core values as they grow and change?
I believe that if they're designed well, they should rarely, if ever, change. So this goes back to design. And I make an example of this in my book with Steve Jobs, and it's that good design withstands the test of time. We see this in real life all over the place. I'll use a good example of that. If you look at a Chevy truck, and you can look at one that's 10 years old, 5 years old, 20 years old, they kind of look the same. They don't change that often because it's good design. Good design withstands the test of time. And you can look at skyscrapers that symbolize that. You can look at bridges. Good design withstands the test of time. So when you design your core values and they're authentic to the soul of the organization, rarely, if ever, should they change. And there's a great book by Jim Collins and Jerry Porras called Built to Last, where they examine visionary companies throughout the 20th century. And that's what they found, was that they rarely, if ever, changed because they stood for things that were non-negotiable. What I tell people is, if a value is truly a value, you would be willing to lose money to make it be true in your business. So.
Rarely do we hear in sports that a winning team doesn't have a good culture, but we always hear a losing team has a bad culture. Most everyone probably have seen the Michael Jordan documentary, and it seemed in retrospect, they were glad to be part of championship teams, but at the time they hated it. Some even left to go to other teams because of the culture. Can you have a quality culture without great success and have a dysfunctional culture with great success?
I'm not going to say you can't have a championship team without a great culture. It's kind of a loaded question, if you ask me, because what does a good culture even mean, right? You could have a winning culture that is a hard culture to be a part of. So culture is a result. and I think a lot of times people act like culture is this like box that, excuse me, I'm having this. So I don't believe that. I believe that what we're talking about here is good versus bad. And my answer is there's neither. That, like, that's a label. You are what you are. It's optimizing for what you are. So my belief is that I can win with any culture as long as the people involved in it believe in it and support it and make it come to life. That might be a really hard place to be for some people, and those people can leave. But for the right people, it might be the best place. So there's a quote I say in my book is that core values don't need to be nice. And
Yeah, talk about that.
well, we're talking about that right now. If you are a like warrior culture, let's use the Bulls of the 90s, maybe that was a warrior culture. And if you were a more like harmony driven person, you may not be happy in a warrior culture. Does that mean that a warrior culture is bad? It is for the harmony driven person, but for the warrior driven person, it's where they want to be. I'll use another example. Let's use Uber. Uber, under the leadership of Travis Kalanick, one could say had a toxic culture, but they also created a multi-billion-dollar business. Now, at a certain point, it didn't scale well and he had to leave, but what they did is extraordinary. So is that a bad culture? I don't know. Depends on what I would love to have that culture if I didn't care about some of the things they didn't care about. Me personally, I wouldn't enjoy doing that because I think they did unethical things. Other people don't care about that stuff. So is that a bad culture? I don't think so.
But what about the core values? Like, even back, I mean, I go way back before you do. The Yankees under Reggie Jackson, Billy Martin had winning teams in the 70s, won World Series, but they were a really dysfunctional group that hated each other. And what was the core values that allowed them to win championships? And you've seen companies who have great core values that just kind of putter along. People feel good about it. Do you equate great core values with success, or they're totally different?
Again, it depends. I don't have a label around values at all. So what if your core value is win at all costs? Right?
Yeah.
Is that a bad versus a good core value? It just depends on what your personal definition of good and bad is. So I don't have a belief around that. If you're an organization and your core value is win at all costs, then you're living up to that core value. Now, society may not like that, but if you don't care what society thinks, does that matter? It just depends on what you want. I would never run an organization like that, nor would I want to be a part of an organization like that. But should I judge another organization as a bad organization because they have a win at all costs ethos? I don't know. I mean, that's the point I try to make in the book is I would rather they be authentic to who they are, even if I don't agree with them, than do what most people do, which is get their marketing people involved, water down the values, throw some fake vanilla core values on the wall. And then the reality is they are a win at all costs and everyone hates each other. And they're not being authentic to who they are.
Doesn't your belief system sounds like a religion?
I mean, I'm not a religious person, so I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. What I would say is that what is a religion really, right? So that's my question. What do you mean by the word religion? Is that there's a common group of values? So I mean, under that premise, aren't all religions the same then? Because most religions share the same values. They just kind of call them different things. So
yeah,
maybe,
even their stories are the same.
right. So which religion are we talking about? I think all religions are the same.
As someone applying to join a team, a company, besides looking at their website, are there questions you can ask them to learn about their culture more accurately?
I think that if I'm applying to a company, the two things I'm going to do is I'm going to go and look to see, do they actually promote their values? Number two, I'm going to go look at employee reviews online to see what are people saying about them. I'm not going to believe just one employee though. And then lastly, I'm going to interview the company for references on what they are. I'm not going to just hope that I show up and that they live up to these things that they say they are. I'm going to do the same work they're doing on me, and I'm going to make sure that they are what they say they are. So I think it's a reverse interview. When I interview employees, I'm going to make sure their core value fit because I'm a core value driven CEO, and then I'm going to check their references because I don't necessarily know if they're telling me the truth or not. So I'm going to do as much homework as I can to read between the lines. I think employees should do the exact same thing.
In the book, the teacher in a class you took asked if your employees and customers knew your core values. Why is it important your clients know? And I doubt anyone on this call knows Microsoft, Amazon, Harvard, the Patriots, practically any successful organization's core values.
I think it's a gesture to put yourself out there. And when you do that, you're then to be held accountable to that standard. And I believe that I actually think it's a tool for growth. If I tell the world what I am and hold myself accountable to that, I will attract people that believe what I believe. And by the way, I look at customers as twofold. There's your internal customer and your external customer. My external customer is the person that pays money to buy my service. My internal customer is the person I pay money to create the service. And at the end of the day, my external customer's experience is purely a mirror of my internal customer's behavior. And I can only control that, I believe, by making the core values become the language of the organization, because then I can create limitless scale around behavior.
Uh, can't one ask for examples of how they demonstrate their values?
Are we talking about like a team or a person? I
I
don't
like an
under-
organization. You go apply to an organization or you're working with a specific organization. I mean, a lot of companies even look at if they're going to partner with somebody or use them as a vendor, they actually study your core values and see if they line up with their own.
I think it's exactly the same as I said before. When I interview an employee to come to my company, and let's use my last company, The Money Source. Number one core value, people matter. Number two core value, strength of character. Number three core value, inspiring leadership. And number four, rock solid service. I'm going to say, show me an example of when you lived strength of character. And then we have a descriptive below it. I read it to them and I go through each one. If I'm the employee, I'm going to do the exact same thing. Hey, can I talk to a few of your team members at random? And I want to ask them, hey, what's your best example of the company living the value, strength of character? Have they ever broken that value since you've worked here? Can you give me an example of one time maybe they disappointed you with one of the four core values? It's a two-way street.
What do you mean companies don't have core values, but people have them?
Well, the reality is yes, I know technically a company is a person under the eyes of the law, but the reality is when I put 100 people into a company, I have 100 different sets of personal values. And so they show up every day and they make decisions more or less based off those values. Hopefully they align with what the company wants. If the company is explicit about what their values are, specific about them, and has made them come to life, I can demand for people to basically behave in a way that's aligned with those values, or I can ask them to leave the organization. What ends up happening when you don't do that is I get a mixed bag of core values. I get Tom, John, Sarah, Peter. They all have four different sets of values. They're going to make decisions based off of them if they don't know what the company wants.
As I was reading your book, I was thinking that your high growth mortgage business was suffering from a lack of solid processes because you were growing so fast, and that probably a lot of people felt overworked and underappreciated, along with hiring people who fit your financial model, but may not have been the best people in a high intensity, fast growth business. Where could your core values have made a difference if people believed in and lived them?
Well, so what I didn't talk about in the book was and you're correct, we didn't have any processes. We were growing fast and we was a trial by fire, and we were kind of building the airplane while we were in the air. And we had tons of growing pains because there was a misalignment, and then we didn't have those solid policies and procedures and systems that you're talking about. Now, mind you, this is 17 years ago when we built that company, and you had a lot. It was harder to build because it was more of an analog world we lived in and less technology available. But fast forward to 2013, when I built the business at The Money Source, I didn't have a lot of those same things then either. But I went from 30 to 313 employees in 18 months, and I had an ENPS of 83%. Tell me how that works. The reason for it was that we had what's called invisible scale. And I believe that when you build core values for scale in your business, what like we define in the book, four things happen. Number one is you create the ultimate decision-making engine. People know what's expected of them, and they can actually test their decisions against the values. Number two, you create invisible scale. And what that is that's an alignment, a holistic alignment that happens. When I have 10 people that all have a similar set of values and they understand what the values are of the company, I don't need to create policy and procedure to make them behave the right way. They do it naturally. They don't think about it, right? And so what ended up happening at TMS is we created our values. We scaled from 30 to 313 employees 18 months, and we didn't have any growing pains. Nothing. People just did the right things. And I noticed something. They were all speaking the same language. They were all holding each other accountable naturally. It happened holistically in the organization. The number three thing that happens is when you're explicit about it and you put it out to the world, where you say, this is what we are, don't show up here if you're not part of this, and you make it part of your hiring process, onboarding process, day-to-day life in the business, is through osmosis, people just don't show up unless they believe in it. And you end up attracting a lot of talent who believes what you believe. So again, they naturally just do the right things that the company believes in because the core values are aligned. And so I don't believe you necessarily need all these policies and procedures and systems to do it if you get the values right and make them come to life. I'm going to add one more thing. You show me 100 companies that have breaking, not doing well, low engagement scores, who have all those policies and procedures. That's most companies that aren't successful. A lot of them have great policy and procedures, but they don't have a great culture. They don't have an alignment around their values. They have a lot of misalignment, which creates friction, which creates breakdowns, which creates problems, and then they're not successful.
Well, and amazingly, Best Buy is still around based on your own experience, which I've had the same experience that you did. And do you think they've gotten better at it? Tell them just briefly what happened in your own experience with Best Buy, how frustrating that was.
I had an experience with Best Buy where I called them up one day. This was like after I was building the money source, and I needed the Geek Squad to come to my house to fix like a Bluetooth speaker I had. And essentially I called them up, sat on hold, got him on the phone. The person sounded like they were like the zombie call center employee. I got hung up on. I had to go back through there, this miserable phone tree experience. Same thing happens again. I get hung up on, disconnected. And I think I'm 3 or 4 rounds deep till I finally get my problem. It takes like an hour to deal with this thing. And I'm super frustrated. And it was just this terrible experience. And I could just tell they didn't care about their job and they didn't have good systems. But more importantly than that, their systems were not baked in a desire to please the customer, right? And so in the book, I use the example of Apple, which I had an experience with them a couple of weeks later, where I call them up. The first thing they do is ask me for my phone number in the event that we get disconnected. The phone tree was easy to use. It got me into someone very quickly. And then they asked me about the previous thing I had called about like a year ago to make sure it was still fixed, right? And so right off the bat, like my guard was down. I was like, wow, these guys really care. And I had a great experience with them. And I said, Best Buy, there's a lot of companies that do it the wrong way. And I believe that in the economy that we've been in over the last, call it 20, 30 years, more of an analog, less digital, less commoditized economy, I think you could have got away with it. If you're capitalized well enough and you have enough of the corporate infrastructure, and you could build a business that has a mediocre environment to work in or mediocre care for the customer. I believe that will be gone 10 years from now, because technology is much better. It's cheaper. It's more omnipresent. Price, when that happens, it drives price down. Price becomes more commoditized. So if price is commoditized and technology is commoditized, what's your differentiating value proposition? People.
Yeah, no question.
Yeah.
In the virtual landscape, how does your approach ensure new hires can acclimate? Any examples specifically post joining?
Well, I mean, the company, what I didn't tell you is when we went from 30 to 313 employees, 275 of them were remote. I left that tidbit out. So yeah, it's harder to manage people remote. It's harder to engage. You had to be, again, you get the organization that you design and deserve. And so we got very intentional about designing our culture. We got very intentional about designing our tools around engagement. There's a lot of stuff that we did to make sure that the core values were nurtured. And I talk about that in chapter 7 of the book. So look, I believe that technology speeds up whatever's already there in an analog world. If you don't have human connection in an analog world because we're remote, then you have to figure out other ways to do it. and technology can help expedite that, but you don't get that physical touch. I don't get that water cooler talk. So I have to work around it and do as best as I can. I don't believe, by the way, that in this digital world where people are remote, that this is going to stick the way the way other people think it's going to stick. I think that it's an important thing, and I've always been a fan of it in certain areas of the business. But I ended up going from massively remote to going back to an analog, like in-person environment, because I realized it was such an expense of having people disparate and remote. And so I believe the values, when they're designed for scale, they need to become the language of the organization. A language is a language. It doesn't, like, it's not like when you're speaking on Zoom, you speak a different language. You either are speaking the same language or you're not. And if the core values have become the language of the organization, you're just doing it over a different format.
How do you help folks who are just beginning to explore their core values, especially young folks or folks new to organizational life that they think they do, but haven't had the chance to see them actually grow?
Are we talking about personal or professional?
I think maybe both, maybe answer for both.
Well, look, I think like core values is a thing that we can all do before you're even in a business. And so like my family has, we built family core values. Probably my next book will be about how do you build your family core values. But that core values are something, I mean, I have a tool on my website. If you go to my website, you can get our core value finder, and it'll basically, you can figure out your core values. I believe that core values are the language of our lives, and they control our behavior. They give us a centering for knowing what we should and shouldn't do. When we break them, we feel the friction. When we're engaged in them, we feel alive and we feel in a flow state. We feel comfortable. And so what I believe that a company has an opportunity to create core values for the organization. And I believe the core values should demonstrate the personality of the organization so that people know understood what is expected of them. And when that happens at mass, you create massive alignment in the organization. On an individual basis, I believe that the individual will want to make sure their personal core values are not in conflict with the company's core values that they're a part of. If they are, they should probably find a new company to work for. And vice versa, the company has an obligation to make sure that their team's core values are aligned with the company's. And if they don't, they should help them find a new place to go.
It's a good answer. At what stage of growth and size of a tech company's value become critical factor for scaling up?
I believe from day one.
Because you said you're not changing it no matter what the size of the company is.
Yeah, I will say this is that, like, until you've been in business for 3 to 5 years, the personality of the organization may not be fully baked, right? A newborn baby probably does not completely formed its personality until it's about 3 to 5 years old. And so there is probably, if you do it before you're built, I mean, again, this is a new business. It's really going to be baked around the founders' values at that point. But as the organization grows, it's not just the founders. You have an executive team. The personality of the company will evolve over those 5 years. So if it's a startup, what I tell them is you may have to go do a facelift in year 3, 4, 5. And because at that point, you'll really understand what the organization is about. The only other time I can say it is if, let's say, private equity is involved, and then you bring in a new CEO and the CEO is not aligned with the values, which I think is a mistake, but let's just say they do it, then you may have to change the values because the company is going to be managed to a different set of behavior at that point.
I think that we learn our core values from our parents at a very young age, and they kind of stick with us. I mean, when you see kids go awry in school, whatever that might be that they've done, I think that may have been a breakdown in the core values that we as parents place in them, which is a way to guide them going forward. And I think that also determines what kinds of organizations they get involved in. Like you said, there's not a good and bad core values. There's one people might have a set of core values that you and I don't agree with, but it works for them and the people who want to be a part of them. And we see that in the election now, that each side has its own set of core values, and it depends on what side you feel most comfortable with. Darius, they're asking, please restate your first recommendation he gave other than interviewing the company and looking at employee interviews to look for in assessing a company's culture.
I mean, if I'm an employee and I'm assessing culture, I'm going to go read company reviews. and I'm gonna grill them on giving me examples of the company being how they live their core values, when have they broken them, when have they had challenges with them. Yeah, just like whatever feels comfortable to like really get an understanding. And then I'm going to ask if I could talk to the team, and I'm going to ask them the same questions, and I'm going to ask them what's your best example of core value X, Y, and Z being alive and well in the organization. Give me an example of when they've broken it. How did they fix it? Because by the way, companies are always going to break their values. That's just part of life. We're human beings. Human beings make mistakes. The question is going to be is what do they do to fix it when they break them? This is like having a bad customer experience. Like I tell people we're going to have bad customer experiences. Core values are not nirvana, but they do give us a focal point to get back to center to fix the problems.
And no question, I think that's for us for life, right? Your parents gave you a set of core values that actually made you excellent entrepreneurs, you and your brother, right? He's an entrepreneur as
Correct.
well. And that's helped you become a resilient person at the same time.
I want to add something though, what you said. I don't necessarily believe we get our full values from our parents. Some of it's nature and some of it's nurture. And so I believe that, and there's a whole idea around this theory called spiral dynamics, that our core values are an evolutionary process, personally speaking. And so how in touch you are with who you authentically are as a person will help you figure out what your values are. And a lot of that's dictated by friends, family, community. But there's examples of people that are always not fitting into those things because their values are just different innately. And they got to go out there and that's a hard place to be because your company may not be okay with, or your family may not be okay with you being different. And sometimes you got to fight for what you are. And what I say is that's why I say core values. There's no such thing as bad or good core values. You are what you are. Be authentic to them, whether people agree or disagree. As long as you know that you're being authentic to yourself, that's what matters. But I will agree that a lot of that is shaped by family, religion, community, and sometimes not. Sometimes we are what we are, and we're just different.
No, no question about it. We all see, you know, um, friends who turn out differently than when they started. And you looked at their parents and you think, oh my God, they had great core values, everything else. But you're right, there's a lot into the mix. Um, Someone's writes here, I imagine the majority of businesses do not actually abide by their core values. Business gets in the way. Is that what you find as well?
I think a majority of businesses don't really have core values that are alive and well in their organization, and that they're just running their business from fire to fire. And so, yes, I agree with that statement. But I believe the real opportunity is to be, number one, discover what your values are. Number two, design them for high utility value. Number three, roll them out so the team learns what they are. Number four, implement them on an ongoing basis so that they are used for decision making. And number five, measure for efficacy on an ongoing basis and optimize. When you do that, then you will not break your values, or when you do, you will fix it. And I believe that is when you really get enormous growth in your business, because you attract the right team, you attract the right customers, and you repel the wrong customers and you repel the wrong team. And then you start to get a flywheel of growth, and it gets faster and faster and faster. And there's less breaking of the values because they're such an important part of the business.
Yeah, but I do see where he comes from, because if you took a look at what happened with Wells Fargo, where they were making up these false accounts because people were so driven to make the money and reach their goals. And we see this happen all the time. Goldman Sachs, doesn't matter who it is, they believe they have a set of core values that are really strong, positive, and so forth. But then when it comes time to meeting your quarterly numbers, then people can get, they're making a hard choice here.
Well, I would claim that that's a break in their incentive system, and that you get what you incentivize for. So if you want people to live the values, you need to create an incentive system that aligns to the values. Again, this is where, if I have an incentive, if I have a system for decision making and everything is baked out of that, including every incentive system, the question should be asked is, does this incentive system align with our values? If the answer is no, it shouldn't be your incentive system. It's easy. But if you're designing an incentive system that's fully out of alignment with your values, I can tell you what the end result will be. People are going to break the values. Simple. So you get what you incentivize for, and I'm firmly all about incentivizing for living the core values. And you could create monetary values that align with your business values. You have to, or monetary systems that align with your values. That is a decision. It's a strategic decision. So if you have someone breaking that, they shouldn't be there. You should get rid of them.
This conversation resonates very strongly with introspective individuals. What about the many folks who don't think about this at all? They come to work to do a good and fair job, but they don't really think much beyond that. How do you acclimate them into the organization?
Well, going back to what I said before, you design the values so they're authentic to the personality of the organization. The book talks about that. Then you discover for authenticity, design for high utility. Number 3 is the most important part. By the way, go back to what I said earlier in the talk. When I recruit people, I put them through a pretty heavy core value recruitment process. I then onboard them. The first 8 hours are in my company. All they're doing is learning. We do a full day on our core values. So I'm teaching them the language of the organization. I'm immersing them in the language. So think about this. If you show up at a company, let's say you interview through an 8-hour interview process, and all like a majority of it is based around values fit. Then your first day on the job, I spent 8 hours working on teaching you the values. Then you go into the job and we talk about our core values in our huddles. We talk about them in our weekly one-on-ones. We talk about them in all of our technology systems. In my companies, we had employee recognition systems where we would give each other kudos for doing stuff. You'd always pick a value and give kudos. So if you're doing all these things, once every other week, we'd ask the question, who lived one of our core values in the organization that you work with? How do they live it? What's their name? And when did they do it? And then we'd share those stories with everybody. If you're in an organization that does all that, you tell me if they're going to be behaving around the core values or not. If whether they're introspective or not, it's designed for use at that point. They know what's expected of them. And they're either going to get with the program or they're going to not fit.
Is there certain, let's say you were going to develop these core values, are there a few building blocks you should start with that are executable?
Yeah, the book covers it. You have to make it very simple or else people won't do it. So the time process to create high utility value core values is a time intensive process. Think of the iPhone. They put a lot of time and effort into the design of that product so that we are now a world of photographers, right? That didn't happen accidentally. That happened through a ton of intention and time. So the heavy lifting is around the design. And what I would say is you need to design them for heavy use. They need to be authentic to the soul of the organization. The book in chapters 4 and 5 talk about that at detail. Then you need to roll them out. And in chapter 6, we talk about how do I immerse the team in the new language of the values? And then ongoing is where people usually fall off. I call the rollout process the core value wedding, and then they're in a core value marriage and they don't talk to their spouse ever again. And I say, well, there's a thing called a divorce in real life. If you give a wedding, you don't talk to your spouse. So it's no different in a company. If you have that core value wedding, that immersive rollout, and then they go to work and it's business as usual, and the core values aren't being used, well, they're going to say this is BS. So I believe you have to make that very, very simple. Chapter 7 of the book, we create some very easy, simple things that you can do. And there's a word in Japanese I love. It's called shibui. That means there's complexity and simplicity. So the book is really about designing for simplicity, but for heavy efficacy. And if you do that, they'll be alive and well, the organization. Anyone can do it, but you got to make it easy or else they won't.
So 2 more quick questions here. One is, what problems does an independent contractor-based organizations have in driving core values?
I think it's the same thing. You should still be treating the people you're going to be working with. I go so far I'm going to take it back a step. I interview my vendors based on their values as an organization, literally my vendor. So it's the same deal. The contractor either aligns to our core values or not. You shouldn't hire them if they don't. Do you have a process around vetting vendors? Do you have a process around vetting your contractors? And if the answer is no, then you get what you're going to get. Who knows?
I'm forgetting the guy's name, but the founder CEO of Bridgewater. And the question is, how do you think Dario of Bridgewater's preach business core values?
I don't know their values, but I believe that the best companies make best use of this. And so I would need to know what they were, and I would need to see examples. And chapter 8 in the book is all around measuring for ROI. Are they doing ENPS? Are they doing Q12? Are they measuring for engagement in their team? Highly engaged team with high level, high utility values means the values are alive and well. In my company, we measure the core values on a monthly and quarterly basis. are you actually, I mean, Peter Drucker said it best. If you can't measure it, you can't improve it. So my belief is I don't just take it for like, oh, I think we're doing a good job. We got a good culture. Forget that. I measure it like it's the profit and loss statement.
Excellent, excellent. One last question here. And in the book, you talked about getting the team involved in developing core values. What's your experience with that? Should it just come from the CEO? You talk about this in the book.
Yeah, I don't believe it should just be the CEO. Vern Harner said, he and I talked about this specifically. He said, you can be rich or you can be king. And at the end of the day, the organization has a personality. And if it perfectly aligns to what the CEO is, then great, that's fine. But I believe it should be people that are going to be there for the long haul, that truly understand the personality of the organization, and they're not going to negotiate just to please other people on the values.
All right,
So
the very last question. Very last
you got to
question
pick who
here
those
is,
people are.
how do you make
Yes.
it sticky? This is the last question. How do you make it sticky?
Yeah, chapter 7, literally chapter 7 of the book is how do you make them sticky and viral.
Right.
It goes back to, it's like anything. It has to be designed for high utility value. If it's not designed to go sticky, it won't go sticky. So so we have a system in the book. The team has to be designed to be remembered. It has to be designed in the tone of the language of the organization. It needs to be memorable. We use Miller's Law, so it can't be more than 9 words. And you have to essentially use it, create a tool for high utility value. So the book outlines that. Discover for authenticity, design for high utility value, roll out for immersion. And then ongoing stickiness is around nurturing those values in an easy way and we talk about that in the book, and there's a bunch of recommendations we give.
So I'd like everybody, one of the things I have to say, Darius, is that people ask a lot of questions. So this topic is a very hot topic for people. I hope people will come out and, I guess they can't see my book, but they see it behind you, behind your shoulder.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. And I hope people will get this book. And I hope that when you write your next book, we'll have you back again. And I appreciate everybody coming out, and I appreciate everyone's questions. And I want to thank you. And we look forward to following you. And you did a great job.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being on your show. And yeah, please support the book. It's a #1 bestseller on Amazon. And if you love the book, please write a review.
Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
Everybody.
You as well. And I appreciate everyone. If anyone wants to connect with me, they can connect with me at Darius@therealdarius.com.
Wonderful. I'll make sure everybody gets your email.
Perfect. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
Take care. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.